In the Yukon, winter arrives like a verdict. Rivers stop mid-motion, locked in ice thick enough to drive a truck across. Lakes turn to pale stone. For nearly 6 months, the territory looks less like a landscape and more like a photograph of one. Almost none of that stillness is real. Glaciers the size of small countries keep creeping forward. A caribou herd bigger than the human population of the entire territory is still walking somewhere in the dark. And, in the leaf litter of the boreal forest, one small animal takes stillness further than anything else alive here. It lets its own heart stop and waits for spring to start it again. To understand how that's possible, it helps to understand the rest of the Yukon first. The Yukon sits in Canada's northwest corner, wedged between Alaska to the west, British Columbia to the south, and the Northwest Territories to the east. Its northern edge reaching the Beaufort Sea beyond the Arctic Circle. At roughly 483,000 square kilometers, just under the size of Spain, it is larger than most countries on Earth. Fewer than 46,000 people live in it, a density of less than 1 person per 10 square kilometers. Even that number hides how uneven the spread is. About 4 out of every 5 Yukoners live in a single city, Whitehorse. Step outside it and the territory empties fast. The reason is geology as much as geography. The Yukon is built from mountains. The St. Elias Range in the southwest holds Mount Logan, Canada's highest peak, and the interior is cut by plateaus and river valleys carved during the last ice age. Winters regularly fall below -40, the one point where the Celsius and Fahrenheit scales actually meet. That swing, more than distance or cold on its own, shaped how people settled here. Almost always dependent on ice, water, or air to get anywhere. The journey starts in Whitehorse, a city that feels almost like an accident of geography. It exists because sternwheelers heading up the Yukon River during the Klondike Gold Rush needed a place to portage around a set of dangerous rapids, and a tent camp grew into a supply town almost overnight. Today, Whitehorse holds most of the territory's population, sitting in a valley along the Yukon River with mountains rising on both sides. It's the last major fuel stop before the Dempster Highway, the last real grocery store before hundreds of kilometers of wilderness, the last stretch of paved streets before rivers and mountains take over. A plane is the only way in or out. The Yukon River itself still runs through the middle of the city, the same water that once carried stampeders and steamboats north. In summer, it moves fast and green past downtown. In winter, it freezes over so completely that the same channel becomes a place people cross on foot. A city's main artery turning solid twice a year is a small preview of something true everywhere in the Yukon. The gap between a season of motion and a season of stillness is often only a matter of degrees. Southwest of Whitehorse, that shift from motion to stillness turns almost geological. Kluane National Park and Reserve holds Mount Logan, Canada's highest peak at 5,959 meters, and the mountain is only the visible part of something bigger. The St. Elias Icefields, the largest non-polar ice field on Earth. Seen from a small plane, the ice field looks like a frozen ocean, white to the horizon, broken only by black ridgelines poking through like the backs of half-submerged animals. None of that stillness holds up on closer look. Glaciers here are rivers, moving at a pace human eyes can't easily register, sliding forward under their own weight and grinding rock into a fine gray powder that turns nearby lakes an opaque turquoise. Mount Logan is so massive that, by some estimates, its summit plateau alone could hold peaks like Kilimanjaro and Mont Blanc with room to spare. Wildlife lives at the edges of all that ice rather than fighting it. Grizzly bears dig for ground squirrels on the thin bands of alpine tundra between rock and glacier. Dall sheep pick their way across cliffs too steep for predators to follow. Kluane is proof that in the Yukon, the coldest, most motionless-looking places are often the most active. 200 kilometers northeast, that same tension between stillness and buried motion shows up again, this time in gold instead of ice. In August 1896, 3 prospectors, Skookum Jim Mason, Dawson Charlie, and George Carmack, found gold in a creek feeding the Klondike River, working from knowledge passed down through Jim's Tagish and Tlingit family. Word reached the outside world nearly a year later, in the summer of 1897, and it triggered one of the fastest mass migrations in North American history. An estimated 100,000 people set out for the Yukon. Only around 30,000 to 40,000 actually made it. The reason so few finished is its own story. Stampeders had to haul roughly a ton of supplies each, a year's worth of food and gear, required by Canadian authorities to prevent starvation, over mountain passes like the Chilkoot, where 1,500 steps were carved directly into the ice. Many gave up on the trail itself, abandoning tools and boats along routes still visible today. Those who made it built rafts at Bennett Lake and floated 800 kilometers down the Yukon River, only to find that nearly every worthwhile claim near Dawson City had already been staked by the handful of prospectors who'd arrived first. Dawson City became, for a few years, one of the wealthiest and most chaotic small cities in North America, built almost entirely on wood, permafrost, and rumor. Much of it still stands, its false front buildings tilted where the ground beneath them has thawed and refrozen for over a century. First Nations communities, including the Klondike Gold, whose traditional territory the Gold Rush overran, still live and self-govern in the region today. Their culture and language are actively continuing, not preserved only as a historical footnote to the boom that reshaped their land. North of Dawson City, the Dempster Highway begins, the only public road in Canada that crosses the Arctic Circle, running nearly 740 kilometers toward the Northwest Territories, without a traffic light or a guaranteed cell signal for most of its length. It's unpaved for its entire distance, built on a thick gravel pad so heat from the road surface won't melt the permafrost underneath and swallow the highway itself. That detail says a lot about daily life in the Yukon's north. Permafrost, ground that stays frozen year-round and sometimes runs hundreds of meters deep, underlies most of the territory, and it dictates how houses are built, how pipes are run, even where a community can safely put a school. Buildings sit on pilings instead of poured foundations, because a heated structure resting directly on frozen ground will slowly melt its own footing and sink. For residents, isolation isn't an occasional inconvenience, it's a built-in rhythm. Some communities have no road access at all, reachable only by plane or, in winter, an ice road that exists for a few months before the river beneath it breaks apart. Groceries can cost double what they do in southern Canada. Daylight becomes its own extreme too. Nearly 20 hours of light in June, followed by a winter where the sun barely clears the horizon. Living here means adjusting to a place where the basic terms solid ground, daylight, distance are never quite fixed. The Dempster Highway's most dramatic stretch runs through Tombstone Territorial Park, where jagged black granite peaks rise out of alpine tundra like something built rather than eroded. Early prospectors compared the serrated ridgeline to tombstones, and the name stuck. In autumn, usually late August, the tundra turns deep red almost overnight. As dwarf birch and blueberry bushes change color within a single week, a window photographers plan entire trips around because it can close within days. Beneath the surface, permafrost polygons, hexagonal cracks caused by centuries of freezing and thawing, carve patterns visible clearly only from above. Another reminder that ice here isn't passive, but actively sculpting the land. Keep going north long enough, especially outside summer, and the sky starts performing too. The Yukon sits under one of the most reliable stretches of the aurora oval on Earth, and away from town light, the northern lights can appear on more nights than not through the darker months. Indigenous oral traditions across the north have long described the lights as ancestors in motion, a description that, watching them ripple in real time, feels less like folklore and more like plain observation. The Dempster's true endpoint for this journey is Old Crow, Yukon's only community with no road access at all, sitting 128 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle where the Crow and Porcupine rivers meet. It exists because the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation deliberately settled along the migration path of the porcupine caribou herd, one of the longest land migrations of any mammal on Earth at more than 2,400 kilometers between wintering grounds in the Yukon and calving grounds on Alaska's Arctic coast. The herd size has swung hard in recent years, estimated near 218,000 animals in 2017 and closer to 143,000 in the most recent count. Twice a year it still crosses near Old Crow, and the community's rhythm bends around its arrival. Hunting, drying meat, marking the caribou's return with a festival time too when the animals are expected. It's where the Yukon's oldest relationship between people and land is still actively lived, not just remembered. Back where this journey began, the boreal forest floor, somewhere between Whitehorse and Dawson, is where the Yukon's stillest-looking creature does something that sounds impossible. As temperatures drop in autumn, Wood frogs bury themselves in a few centimeters of leaf litter, not deep enough to escape the frost. When ice starts forming on their skin, their bodies respond by flooding their organs with glucose, a natural antifreeze that protects individual cells even as the space between them fills with ice. That's not just a strange fact about a small animal. It's close to a working summary of the whole territory. The Yukon keeps appearing to stop, rivers ice over, mountains look static, an animal seems to die, while something essential underneath keeps moving, waiting for exactly the right moment to resume. What the Yukon ultimately shows is that stillness and survival aren't opposites here, they're strategies. A glacier advances by staying almost motionless. A caribou herd survives by never truly stopping. A frog outlives winter by letting its own heart fall silent, trusting that silence isn't the same as ending. Even the people who came here first for gold and stayed for something else learned to build their lives around a landscape that only rewards patience with its own timing. For a place so often called empty, the Yukon is remarkably full of motion most visitors never get to see, in rhythms measured in seasons instead of hours. Understanding a place like this means looking past what appears frozen toward everything quietly still moving beneath it. There are other places built on that same kind of hidden movement, and they're worth finding too.